welcome to sit on the back benches. If you'd like a chair with a backrest, you might be more comfortable for the long haul because you don't want to be leaning on the pictures. So we got lots up front, or if you hate sitting in the front row, you could slide it over to the side and the fire marshal won't catch us. It's too late, we're starting. And a couple along the side here too. So be comfortable, make sure you're well stocked with cookies, because they're not allowed to take them and put them back in the bag at the end of the event. They gotta throw them away. Food waste, terrible thing. All right. I shall now step to the microphone. I have way too much gear up here. All right. I want to quickly introduce myself. I'm Nancy White, the director of the Writers Project. We rotate who gets to do this incredibly fun job every few years, and it's my privilege to do it this year, hopefully another year after that, we'll see. The way that it works, we try to bring authors from different genres, different age groups, different communities, different part of the country here to campus to speak to you, read from their work, give you a chance to meet live practicing, sometimes even wage earning writers. It's partly because you could go out and be a wage earning writer, but also because I think there's a mystique of the work is out there, the writers produce this thing and then I read it, but oh, I could never do that. And then you see them and they're real people. We have recruited a real person here today to read to you. I'll tell you a little bit about him in a second, but I just want to quickly make sure you know there's a flyer that lists all the events for this semester and a little bit about each. They're all this particular time on Wednesday. Over time we've discovered this is probably the most convenient for the greatest number of students who have jobs, who have kids, who have an awful lot to juggle, so the evening readings don't often work for them. Our next event will be John Knowles coming up from New York City to talk to us about and maybe read a little from, this is only volume 1, from his book. Ooh, I hope that's the only pop today, called How Sex Got Screwed Up. And it is about how civilization has, can I say the F word? Has effed up sexuality with its contortions all through time in all countries. He does find remarkable instances of free and uninhibited and responsible sexual activity here and there in little pockets where society did not give us a whole bunch of hang-ups. But part of what he's tracking is what he has studied for many, many years, decades now, that he thinks if we knew about it, then we could kind of transcend it. You know, this isn't innate to us. This was created by XYZ civilization. So this is just volume 1. It's about 2,000 pages long. The wonderful thing is, although it's an academic book, he wrote it in a very simple, plain voice. He wanted, as he said, for anyone who might even conceivably have started puberty to be able to read the whole thing. So 4th grade and up. Whoa. And it's true. It really is true. There's like every once in a while a hard word, but I'm thinking, wow, this must drive academics crazy. It's written absolutely clearly. All right. So today, and then if you want to look further down the road, you can look at the flyer. Today we have David Graham. It's a wonderful poet and also happens to be here in Glens Falls, so you can keep your eye peeled for him, you know, at Hannaford's or the gas station, like, hey, I love your work. Nothing makes a poet's day like at least the fantasy that someone might be reading what we're doing. This is his 9th book, The Honey of Earth, published by the wonderful new small press Terrapin. And he's been hard at work writing poetry It's been published in some amazing places, including the Cortland Review, Prairie Schooners, Sycamore Review, featured at big national venues like Poetry Daily and the Writer's Almanac. And at the same time, teaching full-time for some considerable number of years, from which he has recently retired at the appropriate age for retirement. And suddenly he could write all day if he wants to, and he's posting all these gorgeous nature photographs, so. His work has this very human element. I mean, nobody's work doesn't have a human element, but these are some of the most human poems I've read in such a long time. There's a recognizable story. You can picture yourself having the same train of thought. His history might be a little different from yours if you're 18, 19, 25, right? The music he grew up with, we were talking about this in poetry class, might be different from the music you grew up with. But that sense of yourself in the world, your pleasures in the world, the things that tickle your funny bone on a daily basis, and also the sad realities, the dark realities, the things we see and we think, oh, that's not right, that's not fair. And he's able to combine those into this complex, nuanced, still accessible, but beautifully digested and open-heartedly shared work. For this role, the director of the Writers Project, I call up writers or I email writers and try to persuade them to come here. We were really lucky because David had just moved here when this book came out. You know, a couple years after he moved here, this book came out. I was like, well, we'll snap that right up. And he grew up in Johnstown. So when he retired, he and his wife, tell me if I get this wrong, artist Lee Shippey, I got that right, Barbara, I know, but were high school sweethearts. And they decided, let's move home. Let's go back to the Adirondack. Okay, maybe not in the heart of the mountains. Okay, we'll look for a good, city that has it all. And of course, they picked Glens Falls, so we can congratulate ourselves on that. And when I was thinking about them as a couple, I realized, it's the secret theme of this semester is marriage. We have a married couple coming to present about their collaboration writing graphic novels, and both the other speakers will end up talking, and if they don't, I will make them, about the role of the support of their spouse in their career. So it's kind of the subtext through this semester. You'll see other things in common among the different artists, but I like that we're starting with David and that Lee is also here for this celebration of his new book. There are books for sale here, not just the new one, which is beautiful and has some of Lee's art on the cover, so you get 2 for 1. But one of your older books, Magic Show, that's right. I was going to call it Black Magic, and I was like, that's not right. Yeah. And his most recent anthology that he put together about small town life, which some of us may know about. Yeah. Making sure I covered everything. Yeah, I think I got most of it, so I better just turn the podium over to David. I will now ooze into the audience to enjoy my humanity through your words. All right. Thank you, David.
While Nancy oozes, I limp. It's perfect. Bear with me here as I get settled. There, I thought I'd try sitting so that I have more stamina. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Nancy, for telling all those lies about me. And it's wonderful to be here. It is, as Nancy mentioned, it's a wonderful series of readings that she's got going here. And when we moved here, we knew we liked Glens Falls, but we had no idea that there was this wonderful writing series here, that there was the faculty of really interesting writers right up the road, and it's just been a delight. discover all that. Little intimidating to be reading to a room with some very fine poets in it, but I'll do my best. Nancy mentioned my book. It's an anthology that I co-edited called Local News, Poetry About Small Towns. This came out this summer. And I like to start readings always with or almost always with a poem by someone else than myself. There are other poets out there. Some of them are interesting. So I thought, why? I happen to have a whole book of poems I love by other poets right here. So I thought I'd start with that, a little plug for my book. The book, as mentioned, is about small towns. I've spent most of my life in various small towns in several states. And when my co-editor and I, he lives in a town of 340 in Wisconsin, and when we started talking about this, the first thing you do when you're thinking of doing an anthology is seeing what else is out there. And we were kind of astonished. There are prose anthologies, there's fiction, great classics like Winesburg, Ohio, some of you may have read. We could not find an anthology of poems about small town life. I guess that's because there's very few people who live there, comparatively. We are an urban nation, if you just go by the numbers. Sometime in I think the 1920s, the majority of people in this country live in urban areas, which means that, I have this metaphor in the intro to the book, but I'll mention it here. If you ever see those wonderful satellite photos taken of the country after dark, and you see the little constellations they look like, there's Washington, D.C., there's Boston, there's Los Angeles, and so on. And then there's all those dark spots between the constellations. So the way I put it is, this book is about what's happening in those dark spots all over the country. We got poets from everywhere, from Alaska to Louisiana, and reflecting in lots of different ways about the experience of living in, or growing up in, or leaving, or hating, or loving small towns. I'll say one more thing. Another great thing about doing an anthology is you get introduced to work you've never heard of by poets you've never encountered. And that was the case with this one. Her name is Shane-Del Beers, and she's from Pendleton, Oregon. And I've never read her before. She submitted to this book, and this was one of several that we included. It has a goofy title, If Tesla Had Aimed His Death Ray at Vortex, Kentucky. I gather she grew up in a small town in Kentucky. If Tesla had aimed his death ray at Vortex, Kentucky, there wouldn't be a girl at Target in a red polo shirt and khakis, waiting for a boy in a Ford Ranger who will drive up steady as an assembly line, singing Garth Brooks's Friends in Low Places to pick her up from work. She would not stretch like a lily on a stem, straining for the sun to see if he is there in the indigo pickup to rescue her from shoppers too good for Walmart, who will let you know it by unleashing a storm of insults that the Walmart shoppers are too weak to. When she gets in, he will change from Garth Brooks to the Beatles, out of respect, and they will sing off-key about the octopus's garden. They will joke about getting a van and painting it like a yellow submarine. You're happy for them, dear reader, because you know that death is stalking them like a panther. Time does not stretch like Turkish delight, and you are glad that Tesla did not aim his death ray at Vortex, Kentucky, because these are your parents. The quiet trailer park girl, the burly boy in the pickup. For those students, I just talked to Nancy's creative writing class. For those students, that's a great idea for a poem, if you haven't written that one yet. imagine your parents at your age. And, you know, who couldn't write that poem? When I was first setting out to write, I did what I suppose a lot of poets do. I wrote what I knew, and therefore, quite a lot of poems in my first book about growing up in Johnstown, New York, and my family, and boyhood, and all those things. And I didn't really realize, I didn't think of myself as writing on that theme of small town experience, but it was only after the book was published, really, and I got reviewed, and people would introduce me at readings and so on, that they kept calling me a small town poet, which at first I kind of resented. It's like, you know, this guy's playing in the minor leagues. You know, he's not a real urban poet, he's just a small town poet. And then eventually I started to embrace it and think about it, and think about what it might mean. But anyway, I thought I would read just one poem from my first book. I think this is the earliest poem that I kept and put in a book. And I had no notion that I was, you know, gonna write about this theme the rest of my life, but here it is. It's called Census. I wrote this in 1975. And it's just a series of images. I was trying to learn how to put together a poem that way. Census. Small town evenings of darkened leather mills and glove shops. The jackhammers are still. Along the old train bed, boys gather at dusk to throw gravel at each other. No backhoes are carving holes in vacant lots. They rise coolly into the air. A cat in the weeds may sniff gently at a tire tread. Along the shaded sidewalks at midnight, a lone couple moves, arm in arm, neither old nor young. Eventually, I got a little tired of people calling me a small town poet, and so I decided I would branch out. I would write about other stuff and put that behind me. And this is how perverse poets are. I decided before I do that, I'd write a whole book of them. And it's the only book I've ever published. It was a chapbook called Common Waters, and the only one I've ever done where I had an idea and I did it, and then I thought, okay, I'm done with that. I've exorcised this theme from my work. As many of us know, poets are idiots. And of course I wasn't done. And then I wrote another book about it, and eventually, you know, an anthology, so I guess I'm stuck. So there are a few in this new book, The Honey of Earth. I always have to ask this, probably I don't know the answer in advance, but when I lived in Wisconsin for 30 years, it was more of an issue. Anyone here from Baraboo, Wisconsin? Apparently not. Baraboo, Wisconsin is known for a number of things. It is the home of the International Crane Foundation, a marvelous place where they have one of every crane in the world. You can go see whooping cranes and sandhill cranes and all the rest of Siberian cranes and whatnot. It's also home to the Ringling Brothers Circus Museum. And I'm sure it has other attractions, but I've spent like no time. I drove through it once. And what caught my eye was this sign. As you drive into, maybe it's still there, I don't know. But as you drive into town, at the edge of town, it says, "Welcome to Baraboo, Wisconsin, the 54th best small town in the nation." Which raises questions. And I thought it deserved a poem. I mean, who decides and how exactly? I mean, that seems pretty precise, 54th best. Later, my wife and I spent a summer in New Hampshire, and we noticed that Littleton, New Hampshire was the 11th best small town in the nation. So really much better.
You need to standardize.
Yeah,
Give them
yeah.
tests, you know. make sure
But
it's a national standard.
I have no idea where this came from, but I don't want to know in a sense because I could write a poem about it. So this is Ode to Baraboo, Wisconsin. You have to love a town for a brag so elastic and middle-aged. You could live 53 times in a better place than Baraboo, as even Baraboo has to admit. And if you're looking for fine food or a decent bookstore, if you hanker to dwell in the celestial single digits, well, you'll need to rise considerably higher on the list. And if you seek a place that's not satellite to some other, maybe you'll settle in Chicago, the second or third best metropolis, or possibly Cleveland, the sixth most misunderstood, or head straight to Pittsburgh, the single most likely to feature in cop movie chase scenes in need of big abandoned factories. Plenty of other small towns lost in the triple digits advance their own decent claims. My Johnstown, New York, remains the former glove capital of the world, main contributor to the 10th most polluted creek, and forever most apt to provoke visitors into saying, isn't this where they had that big flood? It's not. But Baraboo is sticking to its guns, and you have to admire their faith, stretched so thinly down to the dozens, reaching for that statistical heaven where all places excel. You have to value a place that knows its limitations without giving an inch to the competition. Wiley, Auburn, Massachusetts at number 55, or ambitious Christiansburg, Virginia, temporarily stalled at 56 because some high school kids just TP'd the Baptist church. But still a great town. They're not afraid to tell you. Wonderful place to raise children. I'm not one to judge, of course, being merely the 10,011th best poet in the universe. But apparently I'm the very first to happen upon Baraboo, Wisconsin's shining truth. Imagine, to be not merely the circus capital of the land, not simply home to the International Crane Foundation, but one very good place for birds, clowns, and poets to gather up and count their dozens of blessings. And I always have to, when I read that one, tell this story. I read that once in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. And I was always a little nervous in Wisconsin that somebody would think I was making fun of their town. And this student came charging up to me after the reading, and I thought, uh-oh. She wanted to talk to me about that poem. And she said, I'm from the next town over from Baraboo, and I love that poem because people in Baraboo, they're so stuck up. I can't confirm that. Johnstown and Gloversville had the same relationship. Anybody here from Johnstown, Gloversville? If you don't know, they are the former glove capital of the world. And they actually touch. We called them the Twin Cities, and later I found out that there's a place in the Midwest that actually got that name first. But the Twin Cities were Johnstown, Gloversville, and they are essentially the same place. But that's why we hated Gloversville. I did eventually branch out to write about other things. We were talking in Nancy's class this morning a lot about getting started, writing a poem, and how you get an idea, a prompt, or something that gets you going. And I'm a big believer in that method of writing. And as I used to tell my students all the time, you can start anywhere. The real important thing is, where do you end up? So you can just grab a phrase or an image or a memory or something you're ticked off about, or anything to get rolling down the hill and see where it goes. We were driving, my wife and I were once driving home from Wisconsin back here to upstate New York, and it was the first time I'd seen this phrase. I've since seen it everywhere, but painted in big black letters on a white panel truck, it said, "How would Jesus drive?" And I just had that moment where I thought, I don't know. He didn't have trucks back then. So that sent me into this poem. And it's a lot like the Baraboo poem, I think, in that, I'm not intending to make fun of anyone's religion. I am just trying to take that question seriously. How would Jesus drive? Well, there would be no road rage, that's for sure. Smoothly shifting down the entrance ramps, never hogging the passing lane or driving 20 miles with his left blinker on. He would wave joyfully to kids in passing cars. He would leave clear, dry road behind, even in the worst sleet storm or blizzard. In truth, he would be a bit of a pain in the butt, lingering forever at intersections, letting others go first, stopping motorists to alert them to better driving techniques, announcing to the big rig drivers at the truck stop that they should all abandon their loads immediately, pile in his van for the long haul to salvation. Leaving those 18-wheelers with emptied cabs in the parking lot, rumbling as they spewed diesel exhaust into the sinful air, all their cargoes of milk or oranges slowly going bad. Look, a year and a half ago, I guess it was, my mother died after a long, long decline. And we were talking recently with some friends about which is worse, the death you see coming for a long, long way, or the sudden, shocking one. And I think the answer, in my view, is they're both bad, but in very different ways. But anyway, I had a lot of time preparing. She had many physical problems, but also dementia. And so I wrote a lot, and probably will keep on until I can't write, writing poems. And this is a two-parter. Part one tries to just sort of capture, if I could, her personality in her prime. And I wrote this while she was still alive, trying to remember the mother that she, the woman she had been. And then part two describes the first inklings that she was suffering from dementia. So the overall title is Vinegar and Fizz. My mother could not be trusted to tell it straight. She adored welshing on a bet, spinning tales, splashing in hyperbole's lake, relished the circus, the bellow and roar, musk and glitter, bananas vanishing down clown pants in cheap yellow air. First in line for the freak show, dazzled by carny patter. Never met a dog or horse she didn't love. Children, maybe yes, maybe no. She spoke other languages if possible, applied pressure to a bleeding wound, plucked floundering toddlers out of the deep end, getting her good house dress soaked. You wanted her around in an emergency. But what an unreliable witness. She told it slant, but never all. Couldn't tell it straight, I think, but when have facts ever been the point of any tale? Don't bet against her, friend. Did her many balloons wobble brightly to the ceiling? Yes. Did she place a single peanut on my pudgy palm for the elephant to lift with its trunk? Of course. A touch still zapping me 60 years later. My mother would never turn away from any elephant, juggler, parade, song, or barker beating his drum of gorgeous lies. My mother's one of those people that others always called feisty. Yeah, and that persisted for quite a while. Part two. The doctor settles opposite her in a straight chair, looking kindly and earnest. And I can tell what's coming. He asks her name, and of course she snorts, "You know that." Yes, he does. But then he inquires if she can say what season. She looks around the ward craftily. Decorated tree, tinsel, cartoon snowflakes stuck to the windows. It's almost Christmas. What are you getting me? Next, he wonders if she knows the year. She glares into his face, allows a sullen pause. Then, 1937, she says. And so it is. She's going on 16, a girl ready to burn and roam. Nobody's fool, a spitfire, all vinegar and fizz. The war is but a vague mist on the horizon. This year has a gleaming, sun-scoured sound. 1937. The train is about to leave the station for the one and only time. She'll be damned if she won't be on it and ride far away from home. I read another one that came from one of those silly little prompts. I don't know if this is still true, but it used to be when you got clothing, especially dress clothing, pants and suits and nice shirts and stuff, there would be an inspection tag in them sometimes. Do people remember this? I haven't noticed it lately, but there'd be a little actual piece of paper and it would say inspected by number 732 or whatever. I don't know what that was for. I guess maybe the supervisors checked the pockets to make sure that 742 was doing her job or whatever. I don't know what the purpose was, but you'd always take this out of the pocket and throw it away. And I got one once that it had not a number but a name. Only one I'd ever gotten, and I always have to ask this as well if I read this one. Anybody here know Sadie Boshiers? That was her name, and I was just struck. I love that name. And so I wrote her a poem. Homage to Sadie Boshiers. Sadie, you gave me this shirt on my back, tested my wayward seams and tugged at my buttons long before I knew I would clothe myself in your care. So I wanted you to know I keep your cryptic message, inspected by Sadie Boshiers, in a little teak box on my desk, along with a Canadian coin and one of my dog's puppy teeth. I save it as oracle, this slip of paper no bigger than my favorite cookie fortune. You are doomed to be happy in wedlock. It's true, I'm doomed, Sadie, and I like to think you might still find me happy enough, though my elbows have begun to poke through sleeves you certified so long ago. Your signature is printed, not handwritten, which to me just increases your impartial grace. You had no need to boast or qualify, just put down one firm line to say that Sadie Boshiers was here, on the job, living the life. It's no statement about the honor of hard toil, no suave calling card, no complaint I read in your message. Still, I accept the odd, opaque blessing of Sadie Boshiers. You step out calmly, robed only in your own name, and meet my dumb gaze. I pronounce that name and feel our separate dooms merge in common air, both duly inspected, both somehow found acceptable on this earth. I'm jumping around in the book to sort of give a sense of the different themes and tones and so forth. This is a hard poem now to do, but we were talking about it a little bit in Nancy's class. I had a wonderful student, a good poet, and of course he graduated, as they do, and kind of lost touch with him, and just last spring I heard that he had died. So I had written this poem years ago and given it to him, but I had to change the dedication. It's now in memory of Bob Bradbury. And what prompted this one was I was talking to Bob one time. He was writing poems about his own childhood, and he had lived in a house that was right up against some woods. And he was mentioning how when he was a boy, he used to like to go out in the woods and find an old rotten tree and just push it over, and similar stuff. And I started laughing when he said, my mother asked me, why on earth do you do that? What is the pleasure you get from this? And I started laughing, and unfortunately he thought I was laughing at him. But I was laughing because I used to do the exact same thing. And then I started wondering, do all boys who live near the woods do this? Is this a boy thing? I don't know, but it prompted this poem called Splash. Boys will chuck the heaviest rocks possible into the smallest streams. Boys live most in that kathunk, that knee-high splatter splash. Boys live most in the splintery creak and release of dead tree at cliff's edge, finally letting loose its century hold and taking down its portion of sky with a worldly crash down the long scree slope. Boys live most in the fuse of ash can, cherry bomb, M80 as they sputter and flare toward that satisfying gut punch sound, that flash, that flame, that acrid sulfur smell that has a boy's name scrawled all over it. If no fire is available, a boy will settle for jackknifing balloons, detonating puffballs in the woods, beheading wildflowers with a stripped willow whipstick. Even at age 66, walking his aging dog down a winter gray sidewalk, a man will kick an ice clod ahead of him for a full block and live a while more in that. Don't know who that old guy was. I always tell people to judge this book by its cover, as Nancy mentioned. This is a painting on the cover that my wife Lee painted. And Nancy also mentioned the convergence or whatever of two people in the creative arts world being together. And we've always said it's perfect for an artist and a poet to be married because we're not in competition with each other, but we both understand what a weird enterprise it can be when you spend half an afternoon staring out the window, and what are you doing? I'm working. And the rhythms of that kind of creative existence are understandable, but we're not in competition. And one other great thing about it is we both love going to art museums together, and we don't have the problem of one spouse sort of sitting on the bench and looking at his or her watch. Are we done yet? This is the first poem in the book, and a student asked me once, do you have a favorite poem of yours? And my first impulse was, no, I love all my children equally. But this is the one I finally told him, I think this might be my favorite. And in part, it reminds me of all those museums my wife and I have been to over the years. And it also involves my very deep love of dogs. So, dogs and art, what could be better? When I go to a big museum, one of the first things I want to do is go right to the old masters, and especially the Dutch painters, because they were crazy about dogs. And look sometime if you're at a big museum at some of these paintings, because the subject of the painting might be some mythological scene or episode in the life of Christ or big shipwreck or something, but look around in the corners, there's almost always a dog. And so Lee and I go from painting to painting, oh, here's a good one. Anyway, I wrote this poem a while ago called The Dogs in Dutch Paintings. How shall I not adore them? Snoozing right through the Annunciation. They inhabit the outskirts of every importance, sprawl dead center in each oblivious household. They're digging at fleas or snapping at scraps, dozing with noble abandon while a boy bells their tails. Often, they present their rumps in the foreground of some martyrdom. What Christ could lean so unconcernedly against a table leg, the feast above continuing? Could the Virgin in her joy match this grace as a hound sagely ponders an upturned turtle? No scholar in this huge book will capture my eye so well as the skinny haunches, the frazzled tails, and serene optimism of the least of these mutts, curled in the corners of the world's dazzlement. I think I'll just read two more. I promised I would read this one. This one is titled with a phrase by Robert Bly that struck me. And he wrote, "Most of the time, we live through the night." Which is true if you think about it. Most of the time, the dark waters will rise, then fall into sun and birdsong, everything glistening, vivid as broken glass in fresh mud. Most of the time, the dire phone does not ring. Your brakes hold firm, fever breaks, letter arrives in plenty of time with a full amount enclosed. Most of the time when we speak our love, we mean it. When you walk the winter cemetery and 50 crows lift off at once from a bare oak, most of the time it portends nothing at all. Just a bit of dust moving around the universe. Just another omen that means nothing really, but what water means, flowing over stones in the creek. Most of the time Sunday has little to tell Saturday night, and almost nothing Monday morning needs to hear. The best days are the first to flee, Virgil told us long ago. But we didn't listen, did we? We ran through summer grass and winter snow, and most of the time, that was just the right thing to do. I'll read one more. I have to read the title poem, The Honey of Earth. And it's based on a phrase, it's not an exact quote, but it's based on a phrase I love in the poet Wallace Stevens. And he wrote, "The honey of heaven may or may not come, but that of earth both comes and goes at once." And it is a love poem. Oh, I might mention, my wife and I were not only high school sweethearts, but were born on the same day, which means we hardly ever celebrate our birthdays, because, you know, we don't want to share. We have to share Thanksgiving and Christmas and Easter and everything else. But anyway, that's relevant in this poem. There's a reference to Valentine's Day, which is, you know, a better day in February, perhaps, to celebrate. The honey of earth. We wake to winter blaze on our windows. The world whitened while we slept through gray-brown weeks of rotten nightfall and littering leaves crusted with ice. We rise like fever against frost, skimming the pane. We rise burning and pure as the clouds piling our backyard. If this isn't our Valentine, what is? We'll scroll this newly blank slate like kids and erase at leisure. The world loves us, we say. The world loves us not. Solve for X, the flurries mumble, settling down to stay. Beneath the tumble and flutter of snow lie bulbs stored in ice lock, ready to burn and shudder upward from their own decay, the honey of earth immemorial. So I send you this Valentine, though it comes and goes at once, though it kites like a snowflake up and down, over and out. Over and out. Thank you. I'm told there might be comments, questions from those who do not have to leave to get to their class.
Which the poet has agreed graciously to entertain, so this is a big chance.
Stu?
Do you have your avalanche poem?
My avalanche poem.
One where your
I'm not sure I have a poem. I mentioned that at a reading.
wife...
Well, my,
I thought it was in the report.
no, it was just in my intro, I
Oh,
think.
okay.
Actually, I tried to write the avalanche poem and it never came together.
Okay.
What the hell are we talking about? I must tell you.
This is good. This is as good as a poem.
I wrote a poem that I read once at a reading around here that was sponsored by stuff my wife says in her sleep. And there was a time in our lives where I was getting up very early in the morning and she was working till late. So I would get up at 4:30 and want to talk. And she would say almost anything in her sleep to make me shut up. and would not remember any of it. And I would later on, I would say, that was pretty funny what you said. And, you know, it's like, what? What are you talking about? So I have a whole list of these things. One of them, which Stu mentioned, one time, this I think was when I was coming to bed and she was already asleep. She says, "Are you my avalanche?" And I said, yeah, I'm your only avalanche. But I couldn't always get her to respond in these occasions. But I love these. I mean, I have to write poems eventually about all of them. But one time she said, "Don't eat thread." Okay, good advice, I suppose. There's some of my other favorites. Actually, I'll just say this one. My all-time favorite was, this one involved a whole scene. I was getting up real early at that time to teach an early class, and she was sleeping in. And the alarm goes off, and she sits bolt upright in bed, glares at the alarm clock and says, "We're sleeping here." No memory of this afterwards. So, she's a better poet than I am. But I gotta write that poem sometime.
What's your favorite thing to write about?
Hmm?
What's your favorite thing to write about?
Well, you know, like every poet in the world, I don't want to be pinned down, but I write a lot of poems about walking my dog. Partly because I do it so often, I think, and anybody who does that knows that, you know, your mind just kind of starts rolling if you're out there, and it's a repetitive, ordinary, kind of boring task, so the imaginations can sort of kick in. I don't know if that's my favorite thing, but it's probably the thing that I write most often about. But I do write a lot of family poems of memory. Still thinking about my parents and growing up in Johnstown, New York, and all that stuff. Lee used to sometimes say to me, you know, "Why don't you write more love poems?" And I think the reason for that was I didn't like any of them. They weren't good enough. And I was very proud, like in my second book, I had a whole section of love poems. I finally sort of figured out how to do it, or thought I did. I guess I write a bunch of love poems these days. One of the people wrote a comment on the back of the book, wrote me and said something about the love poems I wrote. And I hadn't even thought of that as a thread, as a theme in the book, but I guess it's always there. I don't know if that answers your question. I mean, life, I write about life, my life and others.
If there was any influential poet that had any significance on your work, who would that be? Would it be world-renowned, or would it be local to New York State?
Well, the long answer would be take me about a week to list all the poets I've loved, and some of them my friends. But probably the most true answer is Walt Whitman. He's not a perfect poet. God knows. You know, he goes on, and some of his poems aren't very good, and so on. But when he's good, it's just the kind of poem that makes you want to change your life somehow. Endlessly rewarding, I think. And also endlessly influential, because many of the poets that followed in Walt Whitman's footsteps are wonderful too. Maybe the most famous one in the 20th century is Allen Ginsberg, also Carl Sandburg, and just on and on and on. Perversely, I also really, really love Robert Frost. And if Whitman and Frost were ever together, they would have gotten in a fist fight, probably. Very different poets, but I like that too. Yeah.
What book are you reading right now? What book are you reading right now?
What book am I reading right now? Oh, I love to talk about this. I'm reading a book called Air. No, sorry, I just finished Air, and I liked it so much I just started reading another book called Rain. And I'm on the lookout, if anybody knows of a good book about fire, because I started this, I read a wonderful book on dirt, soil, dirt, whatever you call it, but the title is Dirt, the ecstatic skin of the earth. It's just a marvelous, I love that kind of book. It's about the history, the science, the lore, the politics. There's a lot of stuff in the Dirt book about you know, the way we're messing up agriculture, agribusiness, and so forth. But Rain, I'm now in the middle of Rain. I haven't gotten too far into it, but I think I'm going to like this one too. It's about weather. It's about the way the planet was formed, and I'm sure it'll get to the politics of, you know, conserving water and all that stuff. So it's like it's everything. It's a kind of, I love that kind of book, nonfiction that draws in literature and science and history and economics and politics and whatnot. Did you want to hear what poets I'm reading?
I was gonna ask who's your favorite writer and why, but, yes.
Oh, okay. There's so many. I hope you students here know how lucky you are to be at a place with so many lovely poets sitting right here. Read their books.
What got you interested in writing poetry?
You know that scene in Dead Poets Society where Robin Williams asks, you know, why do we write poetry? And they all give high-minded, you know, philosophical answers to, you know, to improve the world and to explore spirituality and, you know, whatnot. And I think he jumps up on a desk at that point and says, no, to woo women. And this was, of course, at a boys' school, so there were just, you know, teenage boys there. And I guess that's a big part of my story. I was a teenage boy and, you know, wasn't good at sports, and I was, you know, what can I do to impress girls? It worked. Yeah, well, it worked pretty well on one, so that, you know, I'm batting 1 for 1. That's pretty early on. I gave you a bunch of poems, as I recall.
Would you ever be interested in doing like science fiction stuff, or like?
I went through a real period of reading everything back when I was in high school, and loved it. And then I had the sad discovery that I'm terrible at fiction. I wish, you know, I've been trying to incorporate more storytelling into the poems when I can, but yeah, I'm not good at that yet. I'm only 66.
There's still time? Is that what you mean?
Hope so. Hope sometime. Let's just kick off. There's this thing called a volume knob, apparently, that you're not supposed to turn. Is that better?
Yep. You hear in the back? Oh. So I had a question, Dave.
Uh-oh.
What, can you think of poems that took a long time to get right? Like you would try to write them, then you'd throw it away, and then a couple years later,
Oh, yeah.
or months or whatever, and maybe talk a little bit about that process of.
Yeah, I talked a little bit about this in your class, Nancy, but for those of you who weren't there, a number of years ago, like many years ago actually, when I had just gotten tenure, as a matter of fact, at Ripon College, where I taught for 30 years, I was teaching creative writing classes and literature classes and freshman comp and all that, and a very busy life, in other words. And I realized I wasn't writing much poetry. I mean, this was I was hired as a poet and a writing teacher, and here I was not writing much. And so I realized this had to change. This is messed up. And so I started a regimen of writing every day. And you would not believe how many notebooks I have since well, I guess I started it in the 70s, but I started writing every day in the 90s, early 90s. And so one of my favorite things to do is when I don't know, what am I going to do with writing today, is to just pick up a notebook from a year ago, 5 years ago, whatever. So yeah, there are many poems that I find in a 10-year-old journal, and I think, ooh, I forgot all about this draft. This has some promise. I could clean this up, and so on. When I was younger, I had a good friend, and we would swap journals. And we would just make little notes in the margin in pencil. And there's a number of poems in my first book where they wouldn't be there if it hadn't been for my friend Joe writing in the journal, just putting a bracket around the passage and saying, here's your poem. Type this up. So, what I'm saying is, yeah, sometimes years pass, but I'm not writing and rewriting all the time. What I'm doing is letting months, or in some cases years, pass, and then looking at it with fresh eyes, as if, who is this guy? What weirdo wrote this? I have to get some distance on it sometimes to finish. And there are times when it's much faster than that, but it's pretty common for the slow cook to happen. Yeah.
So, as you write, throughout the years, your inspiration changes and like what you write about changes. Is there like a certain stigma or energy that you like to keep throughout your work that's continuous, or?
That's an interesting way to look at it. I think I try to avoid thinking too much about, what are my themes while I'm writing, because the danger, of course, is you'll write what you already have written before and write what you already know, and you won't explore and discover. There's a marvelous phrase in Robert Frost in his essay. He says, "No surprise for the writer, no surprise for the reader." So my goal, my aim, and I'm not always successful, is always to end up someplace at the bottom of the page that I had no idea I was going to go to. But then at some point, like when you put together a book, you have to kind of group them and think about which ones belong, and maybe put some similar themed poems together, that sort of process. So yeah, I do that, but only later. I try to separate the writing from the editing and the kind of critical thoughts.
Just to follow up on that, so how do you get to that surprise place? Like, when you've written a poem that you just kind of come to the end, you're like, that's where I knew I was going to end up there. How do you surprise yourself? What do you do to find a surprise?
Well, I fail much of the time, but the way I will start with just some little thing like Inspected by Sadie Boshears often takes me someplace I had no idea. One thing suggests another, which suggests another. So the one thing I'm really sort of superstitious about in poems is endings. I've never been able to really come up with a good theory or a way to explain it, but when I get a good ending to a poem, I just thought, oh, that's it, stop. And I might have, in my mind, I might have had 3 more pages I was going to write. That often happens. And then I'll just get to a point and I'll think, I didn't know that was coming out, but that's my ending. So my favorite kind of poem is the one that the ending just comes out of my pen. And I think, whoa. You can't make it happen on demand. But that's always what I hope is going to happen. Is that an answer? No, not at all. We can talk further about it. Like I say, I'm a little superstitious. I don't know that I can explain it much better. In workshops, it's a truism, I suppose, that most poems can be improved by cutting off the opening and cutting off the ending. And that is because the poet tries to explain too much and doesn't let the reader kind of participate in the process. And so at the beginning, you're kind of clearing your throat and doing introductory stuff, and at the end, you're saying what this all means. Well, if the story or the imagery or the metaphors were good enough, you shouldn't have to do that, is the notion. That makes a lot of sense to me, although I don't always follow that either. I'll try again sometime to see if I can answer it better. Thank you so much for all the good questions. I'll stay as long as people want me to
Some
talk
people
one-on-one if
already
you'd
have
like.
books, and he would,
Sure.
I'm sure, be happy to sign them for you, or we have books for sale back here. And please, don't forget to eat your cookies.
Yes,
Thank you.
thank you.
Having a lot of fun, thank you.
If anybody needs a copy of the schedule, let me know.
Oh, unabandoned. And so, I was thinking, how would you feel about I mean, it's a long drive, but I was thinking. I have a question for you. You know the modern art caused by University of Pennsylvania? Have you ever heard of that?
Yes, yes. Yeah.
And it's going to be like a participant and also.
Starts up every year.
It's really nice that I know, I do.
There's another reading here Friday, 4:30. Yes. And I know there are a lot of states together locally.
Short form. Gets one out of that because, you know, I'm in German, I'm writing in German, but I don't have an audience. So I found, well, this is the to converse. It's very less possibility work. So even if I had that one in my first course, I posted something I started with something about the other. It's very nice. Everybody knows that he just wants you to participate, but he's also very interested in what you're interested in. You can touch on the people, and people are coming back and for the Portuguese world, it's very
People go walk by and make the fact that you're going here. This is for an hour and a half to listen to it.
because they have a special just how you bring poetry to your cities. So people can.
I don't know, I just, as I was sitting here, I pulled that up so I didn't go home and look at the list.
She teaches like a mom, she's curating, she's creating the one section for Target. So there's a lot of sometimes the boards are far. If it's that time,
It's easier to pull a song and then start to decide which one you're well, if we have one,
otherwise, like, oh, what do you want to do? Oh, I don't know.
we can't cut that one. I want to see that. Just wait it.
I think we should have like,
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, there probably is someplace.
early in the morning when I was waitressing at night. So yes,
Aaron was mentioning that David sitting here.
I talked to Nancy about it. I
Take care.
That was fun. No, because it's going on right now. So much fun. There's the best course, of course, from the University of Pennsylvania, where the professor is supposed to be curating for a couple of years. It's called Modern American Culture Research and Addiction. And then she says all these courses. Through all the 20th century.
One back and
They're all quite cool. Look at the figures, the way they Photoshop them in.
No, they're not Photoshop. He sets it. It's quick exposure.
Oh, really? Huh. What I don't know.
Oh, the shot?
Not recently.
No.
2008 was a very good
Actually.
I wish I could remember to tell you, but I was like rushing to get
No, yeah, the scout, yeah.
Just like, it must have been.
Yeah, well, with my brother, actually. Yeah, my brother. So you live in Saratoga?
I mean, different, I think different.
Yes. Oh, wow.
I was at school.
Yeah, we moved.
It's nothing.
So we were in Wisconsin.
I just remember I told one of the TAs, he is visiting with a group of students that they visited from the North Pole community. They visited Laurie Niedeker's cabin in Wisconsin. I wonder if you've been there.
I haven't. Yeah. I know people have always been excited about us. I know you've lived there that long.
I've never been. Oh, good.
Is it in Wisconsin?
Yeah, I think it was going to start at They don't know man, they don't know anything. They really do. They get this. Competitive. Sure, I made sure.
Here, I'll introduce you. I brought a poet.
There's like a mask and everybody. Yeah.
I told her,
So I think that's hopeful.
and I can still squeeze it on.
Yeah, so are you guys writers?
I gotta show
Mom and Dad of American Life. I've seen this website, I did not know about this.
Accessible to all.
My sister they also didn't lock her down. My sister was
Yes, yes, the wheel grader, right, right. So, yeah, so, and I don't know, I organize her just because she's so I so I'm gonna be that boss, even though I don't serve her experience.
just playing with that basis.
But that would be a good place to start.
So now you have friends all over the world.
That's what So that actually
I'm a former student.
Oh, I know.
I just started meditating.
And there's, I just said yes.
Yeah, and there's the Earth Reality Project.
Yes.
Might as well have this be on
The internet changed my life. I've had 30 years over here.
Because I, in the text, I don't use. I'm sorry, I was so, yeah, there's an off. There's an off.
There's gonna be, and it's just ours choose some views. You'll see when they pass this legislation, they're pretty good.
Well, I just want to know if I safely.
We didn't meet our deadline, you know.
Yeah.
Back when we came.
I'd be delighted.
There's a meeting coming up, and there's also.
2008, all of a sudden, a lot of money, right?
Oh, really?
Not changing.
You should develop some.
And then I can't figure out better to play draw down. Yeah. Yeah.
That's why I'm swaying.
Yeah.
I don't bring it out, I bring it in case and I don't.
And you can, but anyway, there's two really good places. There's
Yeah. But the other is audio, they want to.
every time stock changes hands, it's billions of dollars. The thing is, people are like, oh, it's expensive.
As part of what you're doing.
Okay.
Did you bring things
Are the people really have on it right now?
That is so cool, so, that's really from the.
That's what I kept changing.
High,
And then,
that's really cool. So, yeah, I just
also,
do my email, so.
there's more variations.
Does the high-tech recording equipment? That's good. I took it that they did. Okay. But you can just, he probably recorded any MP3, you know, you can do it on your iPhone.
We have packaging that says, you know,
Yeah, well, we also.
And so when people come in with the glass cars, they fill them, they go.
Get to it.
And those are foil out and recycle. And all of those products, like, and just,
It's an open session. There's, I mean, he
yeah, right. Yeah.
it's not, if they do some.
Yeah. And I realized, and I actually went around trying to find it, because where can we get it? I couldn't find
I
it.
went to my pain management guy.
Yeah, that's a brilliant idea.
Yeah, and you know, it's better. It's like,
Like, if you want to.
And the things to do, I start with already health food stores, because that's their, you know, they're halfway there. So, yeah, we approach them and say, hey, you're not gonna help me go to this.
So I think, you know, he keeps talking about steps.
Yeah, because there's a lot of this about that.
And I have, you know, I have really good.
I mean, because that kind of thing then makes people go, oh, this is possible.
been able to explain to me why.
I mean, there's some things like, I don't think medical supplies should just step right out. Next to us. Yeah, you're gonna have to have some amount of air conditioning, you just gonna have to. So, but it's just, you know, the stuff that you don't have to, there's a lot. It's, well, it's managed, you're thinking about it, yeah.
Yeah.